Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I have a guest I'm super excited for today. I have a registered professional counselor. That's a Canadian reference for those of you who are maybe my American listeners. That's counseling in Canada. So a foreigner, but somebody who's a big deal in the religious trauma community. So I'm very excited to have Janice Selbie joining me today. Janice, thanks for taking the time to join me.
Yay, I'm so happy you asked me. Thank you.
Yeah, you have a wonderful story, a fascinating, maybe not wonderful, a fascinating story, which we'll get into. But, I have a laundry list of founder of the Conference on Religious Trauma, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Again, I think just we've had similar people on our podcast. You had a bunch of speakers at CORT 2023 who have been on my podcast. So again, just kind of, I think, building this religious trauma community that's really wonderful for those of us who remember deconverting and not knowing about some of this community, really building it up.
Right. Yes. And then a couple years ago, I also did another conference, which I may do again. And it was called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. And I loved that. That was one of my favorite conferences to do. It was just really fun and exciting and interesting.
Yeah. So we'll get into all of that, but I always like to start with, what was your journey into working in the mental health field?
Well, I think like a great many of us, it started at home with, things being not quite right. So I went into, I became a registered professional counselor, and I have another sibling who became a nurse on the mental health ward, the psychiatric ward of our hospital. So having a dad who is a narcissist with cluster B traits, and then also a fundamentalist, very difficult. Didn't make growing up easy or a lot of fun, and meant living with a lot of fear. And of course, so then was really always very busy trying to follow rules and find new rules to follow. And that really informed my Christianity and kind of what drove me down the rabbit hole of fundamentalism when I discovered the Haldeman Mennonites in Canada. And they're a closed Mennonite sect. Excuse me, I got cat hair here. So that's kind of what got me started. And then I was a devout Christian for most of my life. I didn't even really start to question until I was around 40. And then it was like that. I tell people it was like holding a beach ball underwater, and all the pressures building and building, and finally take your hands off and the ball shoots up and water sprays everywhere. And it was messy. My deconversion experience was messy and painful and terrifying. And I still had kids at home, and I was still married to a believer who had also been a pastor. And so it was really an intense journey.
Yeah. What was, growing up in this fundamentalist household, what was kind of like the messaging you got around mental health growing up, and kind of your decision to pursue a career in the mental health field? What was that journey like?
Yeah. So I learned early on, and I do think this whenever people blurt out to me, I'm an empath, like they wear that title or whatever. And I think it's possible you grew up in an unsafe home environment, and you had to learn very early on how to read the emotions of other people in order to be safe. And that is, that's where I fall into things. And I had one brother that was decidedly a black sheep, one brother that was decidedly a comic, trying to always,
Sure.
and then there was me, and I was the youngest child. So yeah, I learned how to hide and how to blend in, how to be exceedingly diplomatic, how to fawn to stay safe, how to freeze, and how to stuff my feelings or eat my feelings. All those things that go along with essentially having a parent who was, or two parents who were addicted to religion. So I don't know if you've heard me use the term acorns. I look at the adult children of alcoholics, and we as acorns, adult children of religious nuts, share a laundry list often with
Yeah.
COA folks. And that was very eye-opening for me. It explained a lot. So that's something that I kind of keep tucked into the back of my mind. And I'm now estranged from my fundamentalist father, and that only happened a few years ago. And it was such a massive relief. And it's not a relief for everyone, and it's not the right move for everyone to make. But for me, it was. After which I thought, I wish I would have done that years earlier. But you know, it doesn't mean I don't think about them. And so there are still nothing. You don't get away scot-free in any sense. There are always things that kind of hang on. There's residual for sure. And so then after when I divorced religion, divorced my husband, I had been working at our local hospital. I did medical transcription for years and years, but I was always super intrigued by psychology. And I loved doing the psychiatry reports. And I thought, okay, I know there is a college of professional counseling in my city. I'm going to see what that's like. So that was my starting point. So I completed that, and then did 600 supervised hours through my governing body, Canadian Professional Counsel Association. And even when I finished all that, so that's when I started looking at my own trauma, even just the trauma of growing up in a family of origin with an extremely volatile, narcissistic parent. I wasn't even touching on the religious end of things at that point. And then eventually, when I realized, I don't actually believe any of this, and started researching and thought, I have a lot in common with people who have come out of cults, as I would read what they were having to say, and I would tell myself, well, that's ridiculous. That wasn't my situation. And the more I read, the more I went, oh boy, this is serious. But I didn't know anyone else who had been as devout as I was. I was so devout. I utterly believed, and I wore a head covering, and I didn't watch TV for years, and I only listened to Christian music, all those things. And so for me to have done such a complete turnaround on all that, I didn't know anyone else who had, and then had gone on to live a happy, healthy life. And so finally I found online one day, I found Dr. Marlene Winnell, and she, her book, Leaving the Fold, was such a help for me. And I phoned her up because I was so excited and couldn't believe that someone had written about this. And that book is years old now. It's like 25 years old, 30 years old, whatever it is.
1994, I think.
Yes. And I phoned her, and she said, well, you're on the West Coast, and I'm running some retreats in San Francisco. Come join us. Come see what it's like. And I was terrified that it was a cult. And I was so scared as I got on the plane. I'm like, I don't know any of these people. What if I disappear and I never come back? And of course, that didn't happen. And I felt so just embraced and seen and validated. And there were people at her retreat who come from all different backgrounds. There are people who left Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Catholicism, evangelicalism, every kind of group you can imagine. So our situations were somewhat different, but our pain was similar, and we were on a similar journey. And being able to freely give voice to some of those things where there was no other place really that I thought I could do it, it was tremendously helpful. So I love Marlene. And in fact, I met my future husband through Marlene. So so there's a little plug for her. Journey Free is her website.
And Leaving the Fold is still a classic. It's on my bookshelf in my office right now because like it is from 1994, but fundamentalism hasn't changed a ton. Their playbook works, so they keep doing it.
It's so
And so
true.
it's incredibly relevant still today.
Yes, yes. And then I came back from her retreat and I was reflecting a lot on my own experience. And I thought, I'm going to put together a workshop. And so I did. And I called it the Divorcing Religion Workshop because I was going through divorce after a 20-year marriage, roughly the same time that I was divorcing my religion. And there was so much there that was relatable, that felt similar. It's such an incredible loss. And people can't understand that loss really unless they've gone through it. So because we've got the disenfranchised grief going on and the ambiguous loss, there's no body to bury. It's not grief that's socially sanctioned. Because, I mean, if you phone your boss and say, oh my God, my dog died, they're like, take the day. Like, it's so significant. But if you say, I just lost my religious faith, which of course means my identity, my community, my worldview, everything is dissolving around me. I will see you tomorrow at 9:00. You'll be okay. But it sent me into a time of existential angst and crisis. I remember phoning up one of my brothers, the one who's the nurse, and he is an avowed atheist. I remember phoning him up and he was so pleased to watch my deconversion, but he didn't want to intrude at all, wanted it to let me be my journey. But I texted him one night or phoned him or something and I said, oh boy, I just realized if hell isn't real, maybe heaven's not real either. And it was for me, that was a very big thing. And I realize you'll have listeners on every aspect of the belief spectrum. So this is just my journey and the conclusions I came to. And my brother was so kind. And he told me that he remembered going through that. And he recommended a video by this German video producers, I think called Kurzgesagt, which means in a nutshell. And the video was called Optimistic Nihilism. And he said, watch the video, watch it straight through to the end, and then let's talk some more about it. It was super helpful for me, but still that aspect of my deconstruction was painful, and I missed praying every day, talking to Jesus every day. I missed having a cosmic big brother. I missed certainty, security, and order, and acceptance are like our main things as humans that we really crave. And I think it gave me compassion now, as so many people have gone down conspiracy rabbit holes and been sucked into those mindsets, because we do all crave certainty and security and order and acceptance. And for some of those folks, it's the first time they have ever felt accepted. If they're on the fringes, if they have never really received acceptance by people at school, if they've always been kind of outsiders, it feels overwhelming to be accepted. And then to be told that you have the secret sauce. You alone know what's going on. That's pretty heady stuff. And so I get it. Because I also thought that way at one point.
Yeah. It's fascinating when you know what you're looking for, how it jumps out at you, seeing a lot of these mind control tactics. I know you think highly of Stephen Hassan's work around cult mind control, and like I refer to the bite model all the time of like,
same.
this is the Republican playbook in American politics. Like, create an enemy, make fear of the enemy, promise a savior. Like, it's so much of it is religion 101. And yeah, I think when you've gone through it does open up some different pathways in your brain to hold space for those people differently than be like, why would anyone believe this, or why would anyone support this?
And I have to say, the farther out I get from the beliefs that I had, the more I shake my head and I'm like, I can't believe that I believed that. And yet I did believe it.
Yeah.
I believed it to the extent that I was willing to die for it. I believed it to the extent that I tried to prepare my children for martyrdom in that eventuality. Because I grew up in the Satanic Panic time. So
Yeah.
lots of cringy behavior. I definitely had apologies and amends to make to my children, not only for raising them in such a confining fundamentalist way in the first place and filling them with fear, but for then giving them a front row seat to my deconstruction gong show, which had to be terrifying and very freaky. See your mom go from being this head covering, saintly whatever, to, oh my God, now we got tattoos. Now we got dreadlocks. Now we're doing this. Now we're doing it. Had to be shocking and feel like the rug was pulled out from under them. And so thankfully now this is like, I don't know, 14 years later, it's going on 14 years, something like that. So my kids are now well into their 20s. And we have very good relationships, very open communication, and same with their dad. I mean, we're not married anymore, but just a wonderful friendship. He also he wouldn't consider himself a believer anymore. But we just had him over for Christmas. Like, of course, it's Christmas dinner. Well, we're going to have him over because he's part of the family. So that's pretty nice considering I do have a new husband. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that analogy of the divorcing religion, because it is a lot like deconstructing marriage and then the reconstruction that happens, especially if you have kids. There's co-parenting, there's all this reestablishing different boundaries, and you can build something healthy out of it. That's not what always happens, but like there are these opportunities, and I love that analogy. My background's marriage and family therapy, so that's my introduction to psychology, is always kind of having that systemic view. And it's identity stuff. Being a spouse and then being single is a shift. Being a Christian and then being agnostic or atheist or pagan or wherever you land, like all these things there's so much overlap, where I love that analogy that you've kind of landed on for this is what it is like to deconstruct.
It really is. And it's not as simple as, well, here you do A, B, and C, because it's different for each person. And because we kind of filter experiences and interpret them through the lens of our personality. And this is the same when we are in mourning, when we have grief and loss. We are expressing that, again, in keeping with our personality, in keeping with what we saw modeled for us in our home. Were we safe at home to express these concerns, to express our sadness? I don't know about your home, but in my home, my dad could yell and scream and punch his fists through the wall. We could either be happy or we could quietly cry, but we could never be angry. We could never express a difference of opinion. That would not be celebrated. Curiosity was quickly stamped out and replaced with obedience the first time, every time. That was what was expected in our home. And I went even more gung-ho on my poor kids, unfortunately. So yeah, there's a lot to look at. You kind of have to get some distance from it and be able to look at it and take it apart, see where things went off the rails. And then again, like you said, that the bite model has been profoundly helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it's not perfect, but it's a great kind of, here's something to look at right away. If you're thinking of getting involved in a new group, or if you're in a relationship that has you're going, oh, I'm not sure about this. Because as we know, I heard this from Dr. Rachel Bernstein. I love her indoctrination podcast. And one time she said, when we're wearing rose-colored glasses, a red flag just looks like a flag. It just looks like a normal flag. And that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you grow up in it, when you're raised in it, like you are taught to either ignore or proceed with some of those flags as like, oh, well, this is a test of your faith, or this, there's all this spiritual bypassing that creates an environment where ignoring your feelings is good because your body is sinful, or, So there's, yeah, I do this work professionally, and yet when I'm recording or saying some of this stuff out loud, I'm just like, oh yeah, it feels so gross when you like call it out that way.
But it is.
It
But it
is.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm always interested when people reach out to me and they are still religious, because that is not particularly the realm that I'm in. I typically am working with people who have left religion in some way. They either, stumbled out of the church, were thrown out of the church, whatever happened, they recognize that's not the place for them anymore. But I do sometimes hear from folks who are still members of their church, but they're going, I think some things are not right here. And so sometimes, I'm pretty frank with them, and sometimes they want to work with me, and sometimes I am able to refer them on to people like Dr. Laura Anderson, or others who maybe still have more inroads into communities that are faith communities. And
Yeah.
I'm not inside those groups at all. So, but I think there are counselors and therapists needed for people everywhere in all
Yeah.
different spaces. So I'm grateful that there are many people doing this work.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of those things that I see a lot where the growth of podcasts, the books that are getting published, the conferences, things like that are all growing. And one of the things that I hear from professionals all the time is like, I didn't know this community existed when I was in the church. And I have been out of the church for maybe a little over 5 years. And it's like, right, like these things existed. I just didn't have access to them. Like, not only did I not know they existed, but I had been taught to avoid them. And that
Yeah.
people who weren't raised in it, I think, missed that point that like, oh yeah, like you can look at it in an agnostic family and say, well, this stuff's always been available. But for those of us who were raised fundamentalist, like it absolutely was not. The library I had in my church or in my school, which was connected to the church, was not the public library.
That's so true. That's so true. And we were taught, so if we're introduced to these concepts as children and it's our parents or caregivers, some adult authority figure says to us, they deliver this to us, this is the truth, and it's a fearful truth, and you must not diverge from this truth or you'll end up in hell. And we're just little kids. We don't have any ability to discern whether it's true or not. We just know this person's responsible for my safety. I better believe them. We gobble up whatever they're feeding us. And then it's like we put all these psychological booby traps around it so we don't pull on that one thread that's hanging down. And then eventually, because of tragedy or because of whatever's going on, we start tugging. And sure enough, the whole thing begins to, and that's like the most terrifying part of it, because we start to realize what could be the cost, all that we stand to lose if we are no longer members of the club.
Yeah. And the club has been, for a lot of people, like reinforced over and over and over again, that like people who leave the club or are excommunicated or kicked out like struggle. And when you have no personal reference for people who weren't religious or the same religion as you, like you don't know what that story outside of the church is.
Right. And I mentioned earlier about people, we have our temperaments and our personalities. And so some people, I think, can walk through their deconstruction and they don't actually have the Gong Show kind of story
Right.
that mine is. I happen to be quite an extreme person. I have to work very hard to find the middle. So I was extreme in my faith. And then when I left my marriage and I found someone else and I moved in with him, this person was unencumbered by things that had encumbered me and had lots of money. And they were somewhat amused by the changes I was going through. And this person said, go to town, knock yourself out. I've got the money to let you enjoy anything you want. So I thought, I'm going to deny myself nothing. And so that's really, I think, when my kids' eyes got like biplates, because I denied myself nothing. And so that didn't look, that wasn't the best way actually to go about it. And I'm thankful that I made it through safe and in one piece, because that was very much for me like the adolescence I never had. And the stakes were much higher because I was an adult. I had more to lose. So I went through that again, experienced it through my personality and my temperament. And now I've come back to more of what I see as more of a middle ground, even though my middle is pretty left for some people. But I feel like my feet are firmly on the ground again after years of just being in free fall or feeling like I was trying to walk in quicksand or whatever. So yeah, now I'm going to be 54 soon. And I got to say, okay, my 50s so far looking pretty good, like pretty, pretty level.
Yeah. Well, and I think, there's a bit of a trope of that, like leave the church and go do all the stuff that you weren't allowed. I think it's healing for some people. I think it's good to curb some of it because it can get unhealthy, unchecked. But a lot of that has to do with, I think, what you're talking about. Everybody's variables are a little bit different. When you're deconverting, what brand of religion you grew up in, because again, I think fundamentalism scales. And so a lot of that stuff changes. Like for me, it was every time I doubted, my response was like to try and believe harder.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I was in the church for so much longer than I needed to be because it was like I kept trying to be like, make it make sense. Like I'm the problem. Let me fix it through reading more theses. And it's like a weird high school kid reading pastoral theses. And like all these things to try and make it fit. And like finally having kids myself, like I'm not going to teach my kid Noah's Ark. Like I don't like having that recognition of like, I don't believe in it. And I've been a therapist for many years at that point, being like, this isn't healthy to teach a toddler either. Right. But again, it was through my late teens, through my early 20s, going to college when people deconstruct or leave the church a lot. Like my response was like, I'm going to believe harder. I was 25 and on my church council, like similar, different scenario, but similar kind of what you were doing was like, right. You just kept going deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah. And when I was married and in a fundamentalist marriage, it was similar to what you're saying. I saw these cracks, appearing, but every time I was like, it can't be him. He's my God-given head, my, pardon me, my spiritual authority. I'm talking about my first husband here, because that's what I was raised to believe. And the model I saw also was my dad being, narcissistic and unhealthy. Well, and he had a wife who was delightful and codependent. And so that was the model that I had. So I didn't marry someone who was narcissistic, but I did marry someone who was emotionally unavailable. And then me being nothing but emotion, it felt like, and not, it just wasn't, it seemed in some ways to be following the script that I was raised with. And like you, I said, the problem has to be me. I'm going to double down. That's why I started wearing a head covering, because I thought I'm too, I talk too much, or I talk back too much, or I'm not submissive enough. So my whole marriage was me trying to dull my shine, trying to pull back, make myself smaller and smaller. And it wasn't helping. It didn't make things better. We were not really, we weren't good partners for each other. We married only because we were both Christians. And because I was, oh, good grief, I was 23. I was worried I was going to be an old maid. So, so that's why we married. And then when we divorced, it was sad, but it was such a relief, because I was no longer trying to constantly change him and make him someone he wasn't. And he was no longer living with constantly feeling that he wasn't good enough. It was divorce is not a failure. It's a transition.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the healthiest way to look at it. And I mean, we only have however many years that we have on this planet. So you can choose to live it as a martyr, or, spend that time living someone else's dream for you, what they think your life should be, or you can decide, you know what, this is my life. I'm going to
Yeah.
find out what's important to me, not what someone else says is important. Because the church and the pastor and the parents and the spouse often telling us what's important. But I'm actually going to figure out for myself what my values are. Love the values clarification stuff. And then I'm going to order my life accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. And the church works so hard to keep us away from that. It is not trusting your body. I know Mars Shopman, who spoke at CORT this past year, he's just on my podcast recently and talked about like how he just wanted to dance. He just wanted to listen to music. And like that was this thing that the church tried to protect from. And so like purity culture and like ideas of headship within the family and all that stuff is designed to be like, right, you're not supposed to feel good. So like when you don't, you're doing it. That's correct. And then you get out of it and you're like, oh, right, that just wasn't healthy for me. If I'm genuine and authentic, it feels much better.
Oh, yeah. I love Mars. I was so glad, pardon me, to have Mars on the conference. You've probably heard me, or you might have heard me talk on my podcast about my view of life as a huge buffet table, and there are delectable dishes as far as the eye can see, and each dish represents experiences. And religion, fundamentalist religion especially, would have us starve to death at the buffet table of life. But we don't actually have to live that way. We can try a bit of anything, every dish on there, as long as we're not breaking the law, as long as we're not hurting someone, we can try things. And we might like it so much we go back for seconds and thirds, or we might discreetly spit it into our napkin and say, well, that wasn't for me, but we don't have to judge it. We can say, and now I'm going to go on to the next thing. So giving ourselves permission to be curious. And that's really foreign to a lot of us raised in fundamentalist homes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that idea of something is right and something is wrong, and you always have to do your work to pick the right thing. You talk about having a parent who has mental illness. This is a thing that registers for me too. Like a lot of fundamentalist religions or cults, they're the same, but have all these rules and regulations that people who have mental illness or are struggling with some sort of mental health issue are drawn to because it provides structure to their life. And so in my history too, like I was late diagnosed ADHD, and there was an aspect of the black and white thinking that fundamentalism provided that my brain liked. Like I liked to have rules and regulations. I liked to highlight what other people were doing wrong. And like learning about my diagnosis later in life, but also looking back at like, oh, that helped me in some ways and really hindered me in a lot of ways. But I do think there's that pull, there's that draw of people who are looking for structure and support. Like at first, the black and white thinking seems helpful because it provides structure, but then it becomes very limiting very quickly.
Wow. Yeah. It's that same brother who's the nurse. He has a phrase that he uses, and I really like it. Something may be a good servant, but a poor master. And I think that's true. Like it's important to be able to see, if something is truly dangerous for us, we don't want to go there. But sometimes we're programmed to think it's dangerous, and it's not actually that dangerous. But we were only raised with, right and wrong binary thinking. And it's hard to get used to and accept the nuance, because that comes also with responsibility. And again, in fundamentalism, we were told what we could and couldn't do. So we weren't flexing the responsibility muscles as much.
Yeah. And there's very little actual accountability within religious groups. It's God will judge. It's, all the spiritual bypassing we use to let leaders be abusive or move from church to church without any real life accountability.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that predators are drawn to places where they can rise up in the ranks, be in positions of power. This is something that I end up talking with my clients with a fair amount if they bring up the word forgiveness. And I tell them, for us, forgiveness is the F word sometimes, because it has been weaponized by abusers, by those who have wanted to retain power over us. They can abuse us and insist that we forgive them, and then they have the same opportunity over and over again. So I tell my clients, instead, we are going to work on acceptance of reality. This thing actually happened. This was done to me. This happened, or this is something that I did. So that's kind of, that radical acceptance brings clarity. Once we actually can hold on to that, that gives us a clearer view of what decisions that we have, that we can make. So in my case, when I accepted, came the reality that my father not only was a narcissist, but that he actually had crossed some significant boundaries with me, then I no longer felt like I had to keep trying to forgive him. Then I got to say, oh, wait a minute. He's done this over and over and over. Do I actually want this person in my life? Do I want to keep giving them access to me, my children, my family? And I thought, no, I'm done. And it was so liberating, because people insisting someone forgive is like blaming the victim when they have a hard time forgiving. Well, there's a reason they're having a hard time, because the other person either isn't truly sorry, repentant, however you want to say it. So we really need to take responsibility for who we are allowing access in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. And ignoring, I think, the oppressive and patriarchal structures that are attached to these things. Like, forgiveness within an oppressive system doesn't make sense. Like, that's backwards if we're not addressing that the oppressive system exists, because then the victims, we can't treat people equally because there's not equality yet.
Oh, yeah. And oppression is something that I'm still just learning about. I feel like I just am seeing the tip of the iceberg, as a privileged white woman in a Christian type of society. I'm pulling away layers as fast as I can, but I still don't see it all. And so then I'm trying to learn more from people of color who obviously have lived with significant oppression and continue to their entire lives, and reading things that they have to say, and then turning the lens back on myself and saying, oh my God, how have I participated in oppressing other people? It's very uncomfortable. I don't like it at all, but it's so necessary. And I have great hopes because of your generation and the generations of my daughters. I think they're seeing things more clearly. As when I look at things around sexuality and gender and identity, they don't care. They don't care. They're like, okay, that's great. You be you. No, what do we want to do today? Like, they just don't have those same hangups. And I love that. And that's so terrifying for some older people, even people my age, midlife and older, or people who are still stuck in fundamentalism. They really don't like it that the status quo is being challenged and shaken up, but that's the only way our planet's going to survive, I think, is by some people getting somewhat radical and really in our face and reminding us of the cost if we don't turn things around.
Yeah, I'm hopeful when I interact with the younger generation as well. And I think, things like this, things like CORT, I keep using that acronym, the Conference on Religious Trauma, like having therapists, having people from different perspectives, queer folks, people of color, people who are talking about like decolonizing therapy. Like, that's a concept that I love and am digging into in my practice, because it's different being neurodivergent than being a minority ethnicity, but like, it is a minority group. And there's so much that I relate to when I'm hearing and reading from these authors who are talking about, let's decolonize therapy. Like, oh, that's what my brain's been like trying to figure out. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Someone else is already doing this work. So like, I do think a lot of that stuff is really wonderful and hopeful. And working with religious trauma, then we see the religious groups getting more and more extreme in response, which tends to happen throughout history, is civil rights movement. And then you get, 20 years later, you get Ronald Reagan in response. So like, there's this move in culture, and religion and fundamentalism specifically want to protect the status quo. And so there's this response of extremism on the rise, or the people who are staying in the church are the more fundamentalist or extremist people, where other people are leaving and getting out. So it's interesting to see the cultural changes, and also the pendulum try and swing back in the other direction.
And when I when I think of people who have gone from being fundamentalists to more progressive, and I hear them say, but I don't want to leave, I want to stay and bring change from the inside, I think of my experience on Twitter. Pardon me. I love Twitter so much. I really enjoyed it. I was on there working hard and, gaining my thousands or 10,000, something like that, followers. And then it gets bought over by Lex Luthor. saying every terrible thing. Doing every terrible thing. And I'm like, stop, please stop talking, please stop saying anything, because eventually it gets to a point where I'm like, I don't even feel comfortable being in this space anymore. And so then I'm like, oh my God, okay, well, then I tried Mastodon, I tried Threads, and now the other day I just got on Blue Sky, and it's just so tiring. Like, and I had a good thing. I had people who would pay attention when I said something, and it was helpful for advertising as well when I had events coming up and these sorts of things. So it's just been interesting. I feel like podcasts are super helpful. And actually, I told you this when we just started. I had such an exciting guest on my podcast yesterday. I got to interview the icon, the legend, the author, the Canadian, Margaret Atwood. And she, of course, is very well known for The Handmaid's Tale. She's written like tons of stuff. But Handmaid's Tale then, of course, also got picked up and turned into a TV series, which opened it up for a bunch of new generations. And when I watched that series on TV, The Handmaid's Tale, it like sometimes I had to shut it off, because it just reminded me so much of my own life, that I willingly kept pushing that beach ball farther and farther underwater. Other people weren't doing it to me. My ex-husband, he wasn't insisting that I get more and more fundamentalist. I was putting that pressure on myself. But so I'm watching about the handmaids, and they have no voice and they have no choice, and they're always got to cover their hair and wear these, robes. And so when I saw that, I thought, oh, I'd like to be able to talk to this lady. And then my amazing husband says, he says, I know her. I said, what? But he's 22 years older than me. And he said, oh yeah, I went bird watching with her and her husband. I used to fly to Toronto and stay with them, and then we'd fly to Cuba, because he's from the United States. And I'm like, well, I'm glad you told me. Write her a letter immediately and say, please come on my podcast. You've made such a difference in my life. And also, by the way, my husband remembers you and had fun bird watching with you. And I didn't expect actually to hear from her, because she is very busy. And sure enough, I heard back. And so yesterday I got to meet her on my podcast and talk with her. So I hope that I hope it went well. It was hard. It was hard to stay in my body, because I was all like, oh. So it was interesting, because she wasn't raised religious. Her dad was a scientist, but she is obviously extremely bright, very well educated, and a real student of history. So she sees how some of these things repeat themselves.
Yeah. I love podcasts, because they are much more deplatformed than anything else. I know you have a pretty successful YouTube channel that's been growing, and has been a project to grow it, because that takes active work to do some of these things. And like, there's always that fear of like, you put in all this work and build this thing that you don't actually have control over, and then some major corporation buys it out, or YouTube's adding 90-second unskippable ads, which is irritating, or whatever, and so I also enjoy the podcasting aspect of like, right, it's spread out, it's a little less platforms, and people can find it. And
Yeah.
yes, I've had that experience as a host where when I get therapists on the podcast, I feel pretty good. Like, we're peers. I'm cool. I know about psychology. We can have these conversations. And I had a famous comic book writer on, and I was like, small podcast. No reason he should have agreed to be on it other than like the pitch that I gave was like, here's the religious trauma and all the books that you've written. Here's how I want to talk about it. Like, and he's like, yeah, cool, let's do it. But like
Wow.
that fanboy moment of like, I can't believe I'm talking to this person.
Oh, that's so cool. Who was the comic book author?
Jason Aaron, who is an Eisner Award winner. There are only 16 of them. Because Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman won it so many times. But he wrote Thor for many years. So people who have watched the MCU, a lot of his work on Thor is the character that
Wow.
we've seen in the MCU. And I'm a comic book nerd. So like, again, it's when you get that person who you're like, I can't believe I'm interviewing this person. It's so much different than when we're in our, I don't know, area of expertise.
That's very exciting. And I do in some ways feel like we're in uncharted territory as far as continuing to try and shed light on religious trauma. So, I mean, Dr. Winnell and Dr. Daryl Ray, they both been at it about the same amount of time. Daryl, of course, founded Recovering from Religion. And then, of course, Annie Laurie and Dan over at Freedom from Religion Foundation. So they've all been in it for decades. But otherwise, I haven't been aware. But over the last 5 years, whoosh, there's been like the floodgates are open. So I've got my practice, doing my podcasts. I am working on my book. I'm supposed to publish it this summer. So that's something else. And then I told you I went to some of Marlene's retreats, Dr. Winnell's retreats. And sometimes while I was there, there was a small film crew from Sweden who was filming a documentary. So, of course, we have to sign releases and all this kind of stuff. And so my husband and I met through those retreats. And when we got married, the film crew was finishing up this documentary. And we said, well, come on over and film our wedding. And so they did. And they stayed in our town and we got to spend more time with them. And it's just the cinematic premiere is going to be in Stockholm in April, and we're going out there for that. And the documentary is called Leaving Jesus. And I certainly don't factor into it very much at all. My husband is more in it, but certainly we know the other people as well. So we're going to have a nice reunion in Stockholm in April around this documentary. So things are changing. More and more people are learning about religious trauma syndrome, and the recovery help that's available.
Yeah, which is great. We have all this research that says the nuns, the NONE, people who identify with no religion is way on the rise. We know church attendance is way down. And so I think it is an interesting time where a lot of people are seeking out this help and this support and the community, because that's really hard when people leave religion. They're scared of what's going to replace that community. And so all these different wonderful folks building online communities, starting to build in-person communities, like that's the stuff that people are needing as they're leaving different versions of whatever religion they were in.
Right. And I really do encourage people not just to be building their online communities. That's kind of the first thing that we do, because we're looking things up online. Where are these groups for other people like me? Because we can still also be really experiencing a lot of anger at that point. And we know to some degree, like attracts like. If someone else is really angry and shouting about something and we feel really angry, we might get in there and start shouting about it too. And anger is a legitimate part of the grieving process and indicates boundary violations. But if we are angry, hopefully it's helping us to make a change rather than immolation or all-consuming anger. We don't want to get stuck there. And so I also encourage people, well, what's going on in your town? what things have you joined in your town? Have you done any meetup groups? Do you join a snowshoeing group or a bird watching group? Or have you been going out to the games cafe or anything just to try and meet people? Because it used to be the church was our one-stop shop. It met all of our needs. We had people there who were repeating our views back to us. We were singing together. There was childcare. We were looked after if we were wounded or sick or whatever. Now it's on us. We have to actively be building new communities. Our life now will look more like a patchwork quilt, where we typically will have this group for this and this group for that. But we have to do the work. We have to get out there. And that can be really hard for people who are introverted, or, it just can be hard sometimes to put ourselves out there. So do it gently. If you're going to go somewhere, give yourself permission to sit by the door in case you want to beat a hasty retreat, or, when you're full, that you can leave. Is your university or college hosting any interesting lectures? Are there going to be discussion groups? Just get your toes in the water so you're integrating yourself into the larger world.
Yeah. And that is so scary for people who are going through grief or a loss of their identity, of like, I'm not sure who I am, so how am I going to meet other people? And also I think that fundamentalist thinking of like, I went to this and I didn't like it, but I'm going to keep going because I'm supposed to. And it's like, well, if you didn't like it, don't go back. That's fine. I love the optimistic nihilism reference earlier, because it's like, I think people often panic and kind of go to like a nihilistic, well, if nothing means anything, then nothing matters. And it's like, well, no, this is all arbitrary, but that's very freeing and empowering when you get to a space to be able to take advantage of it being freeing and empowering.
Yeah, and that's why I also like the values clarification work, because I am very aware of the values that I used to have, because they were the values my parents and my pastor told me that I had to have. Those are not the same values I have now. I used to put obedience, right at the top of my list, holiness, whatever. They don't even make it on my list now. Autonomy is like number one.
Yeah.
I'm going to be my own person. I'm going to make my own choices. And even to go back every few years and review and see, have things changed? Because we change, hopefully, through the years. We mature and grow, and things that were once very important to us might not even make the cut at this point. So we have to give ourselves permission to grow and change our mind, and try not to it's like we can be holding so tight to something that actually it's holding us, when our identity and our ideology fuse together like that. And then we don't have the space that we need to be able to look at the ideology and say, no, something's wrong here. So we want to learn to hold things loosely so that we can let them go when new information comes to light.
Yeah. So being a neighbor to the north in Canada, I'm down in America. Do you feel like there's a lot of similarities with kind of the culture war stuff and the religious right making a big political move? Do you feel like Canada's a little different in that, and some of the decline in religion and rise in extremism that brings about? Or are you seeing like that's pretty similar on the Canadian side of things too?
I think it might depend where you live. So I'm in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, and I'm in quite a waspy city, but it's my hometown. It's where I grew up, and so it's still pretty churchy. And so I see we just had one of our city councilors did some kind of opinion piece in the local newspaper the other day saying how people need to read their Bible. And so I happen to be the vice president of my local Atheist Skeptics and Humanists Association. So I'm like, I don't appreciate that from my counselor. So then there were some letters written about this. So yeah, there are definitely still, we got a lot of evangelicals here. And I would say a lot of seniors who are very well-intentioned, but who are not aware of the facts of everything. Especially if they're watching Fox News, and we don't, television stations like Fox News are not allowed in Canada. We have different rules there, but people still have satellites or whatever, you can still get it. And so if that sort of nonsense is being preached at their churches, then it gets them riled up. And if they have lots of time on their hands, as lots of seniors do, then they can really make quite a fuss about things. So yes, we do have that. We do have some Trump supporters, but over here they're more likely to be what we call convoy supporters, because there were a bunch of them who drove to our capital city, Ottawa. They set up their hot tubs and their loudspeakers, and they basically held Ottawa hostage as the RCMP went, I wonder what to do. I wonder what we should do. So we do have extremists here. And I still want to say that for the most part, people are well-intentioned, but I think they are misinformed, and misinformation can be deadly. So we do have those issues here, but we have more than just two political parties here. We have several political parties here. So I think that makes things a little more better spread out rather than just the intense polarization that we see in the States.
Yeah. And, not to repeat myself, but like working on decolonizing therapy and some of those things, like you see how much capitalism plays into the American political system as well, and where progress is very slow because both parties, even if they have different policies and belief systems, are beholden to capitalism, which really limits a lot. I look over at those Norway, Finland, Sweden countries that are democratic, socialist, and non-religious, and I'm like, ooh, that looks nice.
I know. And especially right now with everything you folks have going on, it's a lot. Your country's having a moment.
Yeah. And it's what you said too, like depends on where you live, because I'm in the Midwest, and I have most of my religious trauma podcast guests, therapists who work with it, are on the East Coast or the West Coast. I don't think I've had anybody from the Midwest yet who does religious trauma, because there's like four of us. So it is, in countries geographically that are this large, like the geography actually really matters quite a bit. As with the theme of the podcast, what's self-care at this point in your life look like? You've talked about kind of your journey out of fundamentalism and the work that you're doing professionally, but personally, how do you kind of navigate the work you do is heavy? There's a lot of it. How do you kind of navigate all that and make sure you're taking care of yourself?
Well, in some ways, I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about self-care, because I have so many things on the go at any one time. And we know that being overly busy can also be a response to trauma. So I am aware of that. I do specifically sometimes tell my husband, we watched the news tonight, and now I want to turn the TV off, because he is from the United States. So we have a lot of political podcasts that are being played at our place and these sorts of things. And I say, I've had a heavy day. Would you read to me? I love his voice. He has such a good voice. And then, he'll just pick one of the books off our shelf and read to me for a couple hours. And then I can lie there, and I have jigsaw puzzles on my phone, doing my jigsaw puzzles. And I'm listening to his soothing, calming voice, and I'm not thinking about all the troubles that are overwhelming this world. And of course, I do also have a therapist that I call on, because sometimes it's just too much, and I need to be able to unburden and talk to somebody else. So we also go bird watching every day. He's a retired environmental scientist and ornithologist. So we have our binoculars, both of us, and we try and go out every day and do some bird watching together, just being outdoors in the sunshine, in the quiet. I don't have my phone, I don't have my computer, those sorts of things. That is really helpful. So those are things that I do for myself.
Yeah, and all lovely things. I had Jared Anderson, the crypto naturalist, who writes about nature a lot and how it has affected his depression in a positive way. And he talks about, like, it's okay to not know the difference between the types of trees. Like, nature is good for you. It's okay to not know what bird that is. You can still enjoy its beauty.
Yes.
And And I talk about nature being grounding for us, especially those of us who may have religious trauma or CPTSD or whatever, and like being in nature, being grounded, being in the moment, not being on our phones or social media. Like, yeah, it's okay. It's okay if you're not a certified ornithologist who knows what bird that is. You can be
That's
like, oh,
right.
that's pretty. I like that bird.
Yes, and also time with friends. So even if I don't have time to drive over to someone's house and spend hours there, but I might just text my friend and say, "Can we hop on Messenger and have a video chat for 20 minutes?" And that is a wonderful use of technology just to stay connected that way.
Yeah, for sure. Janice, this has been wonderful. I was so excited to get to connect with you. I follow your podcast and I'm familiar with CORT and all these things. But if people want to learn more about you, where do they go? Where do they find you?
Oh, yes. Well, the YouTube channel is called Conference on Religious Trauma. And my website is divorcing-religion.com. And the podcast is called the Divorcing Religion Podcast. And people can actually reach out to me through my website if they'd like to get a hold of me. And I'm on Facebook under my name, Janice Selbie, and under Divorcing Religion Workshop. And I really do appreciate every message that comes to me. I try and answer back.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Shameless Sexuality is the other conference. You talked about seeing where that's going to land in the future. But a lot of those speakers are featured on our YouTube channel as well. So
that's right. And I'm just now starting to upload sessions, not only from CORT, but from Shameless Sexuality onto the YouTube channel. And that is just a fantastic free resource for people, for therapists, for people who just want to learn more about religious trauma, for people who are sorting through their own religious trauma. That YouTube channel has a lot of nuggets of gold on it.
Yeah. And all those links will be in the show notes here to make them easy to find. So Janice, thanks again for coming on today.
What a pleasure. It was so nice to spend time with you. Thank you for having me on.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another episode. Take care, everyone.